try a different format here and go live as well. So this fall and winter outlook for 2025-26. Today's date is September 9th. More information can be found on the weatherecho.com webpage, including the full blog posting, and also on our YouTube channel. Recorded material can be found there. Let's take a look at the weather, precipitation, and temperatures since June. So basically this summer. So we've had different conditions across the United States compared to normal. Whenever we look at these maps, we're talking about a 30-year normal, and we're comparing to that. So when you see the blue and green on the left-hand side, that means really wet conditions. Texas all the way through the plains and the Mid-Atlantic region. Remember, the places in late June and July into early August were very wet with a lot of heavy rain and flooding. The West Coast and East Coast, especially the Northeast, drought expanded in New England, and we basically left the dry winter and saw far southern California, and even some precipitation made it up into Oregon that was excessive. So if you look at the temperature, the West Coast, the immediate West Coast was cool. The Northwest was really warm. So most of the warmth this summer compared to normal was Pacific Northwest, Great Basin, and the Southwest. And that was largely attributed to the lack of monsoon. So if you see the left-hand side shows dry conditions, drier than normal over Utah, western Colorado, Arizona. Those areas were also warmer than normal, so lack of monsoon. Now, where it was really wet in the middle of the country and the Central Plains, there was a lot of areas where temperatures were just normal or even a little bit below normal. Now, the Pacific Northwest was different. They were drier than normal. They should be seeing rain during the summer, not necessarily the monsoon, but from Pacific storms, and they were also warmer than normal. So pretty severe conditions across the West, not just dry, but there was a mixture of dry and wet with a very weak, late developing monsoon and overall warmer than normal conditions across the West and the Northeast warmer than normal. Okay, the outlook continue. And it looks like for the most part they will. There will be some changes though. We've already started to see that now in September. Expected for the Pacific Northwest. So that's good. That's an area that's been dry for months. To the fall and winter for that area in the Pacific Northwest. Also wet in South Florida and the Yucatan and down near Cuba. So those areas could be wet from tropical systems in addition to showers and thunderstorms. Now, unfortunately, much of the West, drier conditions, except for the Northwest, and that's from October through December. And again, we've already seen that start. Now, in the Mid-Atlantic region, remember, they were really wet, couldn't. In the Mid-Atlantic region and the Gulf, those areas are expected to be drier than normal October through December. With wetter in the Northwest and drier in the Mid-Atlantic region, different from what we saw this summer. Now, for temperatures, warmer than normal. So, yes, we're catching a break here in mid-September with some weather systems moving onshore, bringing rain to Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, cooler to the west monsoon. But overall, it looks like the heart of the country is going to be warmer than normal. And that looks like it's going to set up again mid to late September, especially late September, and then October and November. We're really seeing a signal October, November of warmer than normal across much of the lower 48. All right, let's move forward here. Now, what you're probably now, this is the heart of the winter. We obviously can get March and April, but this is the core of the winter, December through February. There's a lot of indications that we will see some changes in the weather pattern in December. But there's also a lot of indication that November is going to be dry for much of the West and much of the West. Now, two signals here to take a look at. Now, I just showed you the fall being in California and being dry in the Southeast. That looks like it'll continue through the heart of the winter. So drier than normal in Southeast United States and Florida. but wetter, snowier than normal with a big dip in the jet stream persisting. So this is not one storm. This is an average of 3 months, which we've been seeing for a while in the East Pacific. That is going to stay put. Road blockage and some challenges with the Pacific. So some of the tropical moisture near Hawaii could spell very wet conditions there. A subtropical jet, a split flow over California and the southeast. And that's why we're expecting the dry conditions on those side of the United States, the lower 48. Jet stream looks like it'll prevail going into Alaska, the polar jet stream. That does allow to be tapped. So whenever you get a amplified jet stream, one that goes north and over a block, you get two things: and potential drought development in Northern California, but you also get cold outbreaks and snowy conditions and a very active stormy pattern line. So that looks like the prevailing black line. So once that cold air comes in along that black line jet stream, that could spell for large storms in the Central Plains and the Northeast. And it also looks like a good weather pattern for persistent storms rapidly moving through the northern Rockies and parts of the Pacific Northwest. So just because you see drier in the Southeast and California doesn't mean it won't rain or snow in the mountains. It will. We just will see less precipitation, long breaks. Like I said, it looks like January is going to be dry, November dry. The main month for precipitation in the West, and specifically California, looks to be in December. So we could see some changes in December, but they'll be temporary. So in these type of winters, we expect long breaks, even though you can still get storms and significant precipitation areas, but they just don't add up. So instead of Northern California getting rivers, they may only see 10 or 12. Instead of the Southeast United States seeing several storms coming out of the Gulf, they may only see a couple of those during the core of the winter. The persistent storm track will be across the northern plains, northern Rockies, and into New England. Okay, what about temperatures? So we just showed this for the fall. It looks like the fall, that weather pattern is going to carry into the heart of the winter. So warmer than, but keep in mind, with this amplified weather pattern, with that big H is in the East Pacific, that's a blocking system, right? It's not supposed to be there. It's an anomaly. But that can draw cold air into the northern plains and the Great Lakes and New England. So there's going to be back up into Canada, and occasionally that will come down during the heart of the winter. So do expect some cold Arctic outbreaks. And typically when you see that, you see more active weather and more snowstorms, even on the East Coast. But overall, milder, warmer weather for December through February. And a lot of that in the Southwest is going to be due to long dry periods from Texas to Southern California. Okay, upcoming year. We always talk about El Nino, La Nina. So a very normal occurrence every 2 to 3 years, you go from La Nina to El Nino, back to La Nina. And then sometimes you have neutral in between. Well, that's what we're in right now, neutral. We're in between. We were in a neutral year that started off with La Nina. Before that, we had an El Nino, and that was 23, 24. Before 23, 24, 2022, 23 was a La Nina. We'll talk a little bit more about that, La Nina in particular. So neutral conditions are expected as we go into the fall and early winter, but we do expect to get into some La Nina conditions, as shown here. So a brief weak La Nina is expected for the late fall and early winter. It's important to look at the late fall and early winter because that's when the equatorial Pacific Ocean along the equator, where we monitor the oceanic water temperatures, and we call it El Nino or La Nina, that is when there's most influence on our atmosphere and our jet stream and our storm track. So late fall, early winter is when we most likely see the correlation between ocean temperatures along the equator and the tropics and our jet stream. So if we look at the analogs, and of course, these are not weather forecasts, so this is correct. We do go into a weak La Nina along the equator. colder than normal, not just cold, but colder than normal in the West and Pacific. But take a look at this. In weak La Ninas, we've seen really wet conditions in California, but here, and in the Southeast, drier. So the reason why I'm showing since 2000 is we have seen some changes in our ocean and atmosphere, okay? With warming, with climate change, we have seen changes. So what we once thought was, a relationship in the 80s and 90s is not. Strikingly wet and cold and snowy in California. Because remember, we had some really big years with weak La Nina. That was 2016, 2017, took us out of a drought. And our record snowiest year with 730 inches at Mammoth was 2022, 23. So all those are included in there. So again, these are weak La Nina since 2000. Now, when we look at all La Ninas and we go back to kind of old school, the 80s, we include the 80s and the 90s when we first were learning about La Nina and El Nino. When we look at the cold phase La Nina, we still see, even with the 80s and 90s included, cool conditions in the Northwest and the Western United States and the South. But what's strikingly different is it's east in Florida when you include the 80s and 90s, and it's much wetter in the Pacific Northwest, the more classic La Nina, right? When you include all of them since the 1980s. So when we look at California and you include the 80s and 90s, you do see those drier conditions overall. And that's typically what we used to say, right? With La Nina, dry. Any type of La Nina, dry. But if we go back to since 2000 and we just focus on a weak one, like we're going to get this year potentially, significant differences in the West Coast. When we include all of them and then go back to, we're really wet, classic wet in the Pacific Northwest, classic dry in the Southeast, and marginally dry. Now, if we look at all the La Ninas, okay, so that we are comparing similar La Nina since 2000. So we don't just look at those wet years or those weak La Ninas. We look at how warm La Nina has been for the East Coast and the South. Really, okay, this is compared to a 30-year normal. Still that cold signature in the Northwest, so that doesn't change. Now for precipitation, when you look at all La Ninas, and this is why La Nina still has that flavor of dry for the West, look at the West Coast. All La Nina since 2000, okay? So that includes weak, that includes moderate and strong. That means it's years of 2016 that I just showed you in 2022, 23. Signal in Northern California. So keep an eye on that dry signal in Northern California, because that's where some of our computer models are predicting drier than normal conditions. And of course, they're also predicting the Southeast United States drier than normal. Now, we're not quite predicting temperatures like this. Most of the United States is still predicted to be above normal this coming, except when you look across the Canadian border and the northern states. So it gets pretty complicated when you start breaking up the La Ninas. Okay, let's say we stay in a neutral condition or briefly touch that weak La Nina, like last year, like 2024, 25. Overall, since 2000, we're seeing temperatures mild across most of the U.S. That's kind of what the forecast is, right? And colder across the northern plains, the Canadian border, and part of the Great Basin. So that could spell for midwinter Santa Anas too, in that type of pattern when you get that cold air over the Great Basin. Now, when you look at precipitation for neutral years since 2000, so recent years, past 25 years, a really dry signal in California and all the West Coast, really dry signal. So the neutral years since 2000 have just really not panned out. They've exacerbated or led to drought like last year in California, 2024, 25. Now, we do see a wet pocket in the Tennessee Valley and the Great Lakes area. And we do see a flavor of that predicted at least for the Great Lakes this coming winter. Again, these are analogs, these are not predictions, but they give you a sense of what's occurred in the past. Neutral since the 1980s. So if we again go back to old school, include the 80s, 90s, and then we look at all the neutral years. Again, neutral means no La Nina, no El Nino. You get that classic cold signature. And you've probably seen some of the forecasts, like the Farmer's Almanac, which is basically climatology, that are looking like this, where they're showing cold and colder than normal over most of the United States. That's okay. But that includes the 80s and 90s, and we've seen a lot of different changes in our atmosphere. Now, when you look at precipitation, we still have that dry signal for the West Coast, which is actually predicted this year. We have a dry signal in the east, but it's broken up. And the Mid-Atlantic region in the Northeast with wet in between. So we don't quite Southeast and in Florida when you look at the neutral conditions along the equator years that occurred, including the 80s and the 90s. All right, more information can be found at weatherecho.com. You can also find the latest TikToks, YouTube shorts, and YouTube recordings that I mentioned. Similar, you can see recorded information on there. And then on X, we have actually real-time prediction and even climate information posted on X. So X is a good platform for climate information. Now, blogs, the latest notes from Weather Echo can be found, and you can subscribe to those. We go in depth, including more depth than what I went into in this live video, but we go in depth showing different climate information, different weather, a little bit of meteorology, a little bit of science of how things work, how things don't work, weather extremes, and that type of thing. So the blog is a nice tool, text and description, and then also to show graphics, pictures, images, and even videos. So make sure you check that out as well. Shared in this webinar is available on the internet. Most of this information was from NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, which collects the climate data and also makes the short and long range weather predictions, such as what I showed you here. All right, hopefully you enjoyed that. We'll do more of these if these turn out to be a useful type of tool in terms of a webinar and briefing. Don't forget, all this is recorded, and there's pre-recorded information on weatherecho.com, either on social media, YouTube channel, X channel, or at the blog. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.